The first sign that my life was a lie was the cold, hard lump I felt inside my son's teddy bear. His name is Leo, and the bear's name is Barnaby. Barnaby was a gift from my sister-in-law, Bethany, for Leo's 5th birthday, just 2 months after my husband, David, died. It was a ridiculously plush, oversized golden bear with vacant black button eyes and a stitched-on smile that suddenly seemed menacing. Leo loved him with the fierce, unconditional adoration only a child can muster. He slept with Barnaby every night, his small arm slung over the bear's plump belly. I was mending a small tear in Barnaby's seam, a routine casualty of a 5-year-old's love, when my needle hit something that wasn't stuffing. It was solid, plastic, and unnervingly symmetrical. My fingers, numb with a sudden, icy premonition, fumbled at the stitches, pulling them loose. I worked the small object through the synthetic fluff until it emerged into the dim light of my sewing room. It was a tiny black cube, no bigger than a sugar cube, with a pinhole lens on one side. A camera. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, painful hitch. For a moment, my mind refused to process it. A toy, a mistake, a piece of the bear's internal mechanism, maybe a voice box I never knew about. But there was no button to press, no speaker grill, just that single, unblinking eye staring back at me. A chill, entirely separate from the evening air, crept up my spine and settled deep in my bones. Why would anyone put a camera in a child's teddy bear? My mind raced, stumbling over possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. A sick prank? A pervert at the toy factory? But Barnaby hadn't come from a factory. Bethany had bought him from a boutique toy shop downtown. She'd made a point of telling me, her voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. "Only the best for my brave little nephew," she'd said, her hand resting on my arm in a gesture that now felt like a brand. Bethany. The thought landed with the force of a physical blow. No, it couldn't be. She was David's sister. She had cried at his funeral, her sobs racking her thin frame. She brought us casseroles, offered to babysit Leo, called every day to see how we were coping. She was family. But the camera was in my hand, a cold, hard piece of undeniable reality. I thought back to the day she gave it to us. She'd arrived with the bear tucked under her arm, its cheerful face a stark contrast to her somber expression. She'd knelt down to Leo's level, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Barnaby will keep you safe, sweetie," she'd whispered, her voice thick with an emotion I had mistaken for grief. "He'll watch over you when Mommy's busy." Watch over you. The words echoed in my head, twisting into something sinister. She wasn't talking to Leo, she was talking to me. She was telling me, right to my face, what she was doing. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I looked around my sewing room at the spools of thread, the half-finished quilts, the comforting, familiar clutter of my life. Suddenly, it all felt like a stage, a set, and I was the unwitting actor in a play I didn't understand. How long had it been there? 2 months. 2 months of private conversations, of sleepless nights spent crying into my pillow, of intimate moments with my son as we navigated the raw landscape of our grief. Had she been watching all of it? Listening? A wave of nausea washed over me. I felt violated, exposed, as if a stranger had been living silently in the corners of my home, absorbing my most vulnerable moments. I thought of David. His death had been so sudden, so inexplicable. A heart attack, the doctors said. A massive coronary event. He was 42, fit, with no history of heart problems. It had been a shock, a brutal tearing in the fabric of our world. But what if it wasn't? What if this camera wasn't the beginning of the nightmare, but a piece of a much larger, darker puzzle? My hand tightened around the tiny device. I had to know. I couldn't call the police, not yet. What would I say? That my sister-in-law, a respected pediatric nurse, put a camera in a teddy bear? They would think I was a grieving, paranoid widow. They would ask for proof of a crime, and all I had was a wild, terrifying suspicion. No, I had to be smart. I had to be quiet. I had to play the part she had cast for me, the fragile, broken woman, lost in her sorrow, incapable of seeing the snake coiled right at her feet. I carefully stitched Barnaby's seam back up, my fingers surprisingly steady. I placed the bear back on the shelf, its button eyes seeming to follow my every move. Then I took the camera into my office and plugged its tiny USB port into my computer. I wasn't a tech expert, but I knew my way around a file system. After a few tense minutes, a folder appeared. It was password protected. Of course it was. I tried the obvious. Leo's birthday, David's birthday, my own. Nothing. I sat back, chewing on my lip, my mind a frantic blur. What would she use? Something simple, something memorable. Then I remembered a conversation from years ago, a stupid drunken argument David and Bethany had about their childhood dog, a scruffy terrier named Rusty. David had insisted its name was spelled with a Y. Bethany had been adamant it was I. It was a ridiculous, meaningless detail, but it stuck with me. On a whim, I typed it in, RUSTIE123. Access granted. My blood ran cold. The folder opened, revealing dozens of video files, each labeled with a date and time. My breath hitched as I clicked on the most recent one. My own living room appeared on the screen, the view slightly low to the ground, from the perspective of the armchair where Leo always left Barnaby. I saw myself walk through the room, my face etched with a familiar exhaustion. I heard myself humming a lullaby to Leo. I watched myself, a ghost in my own home, completely unaware of the silent, hidden observer in my son's most treasured possession. I was being watched. My grief, my privacy, my life, it was all a show for an audience of one. And I had a sickening feeling that the performance was about to become a matter of life and death. The camera wasn't just about spying, it was about control. It was about waiting for something. And I had to find out what before it was too late. My world had shrunk to the size of that tiny, malevolent lens. The next morning I woke with a gasp, the phantom feeling of being watched clinging to me like a shroud. For a terrifying second, I forgot it was real, that the nightmare hadn't ended with the dawn. Then memory flooded back, cold and sharp, and I saw Barnaby sitting on the floor by Leo's bed, his stitched smile a grotesque leer. Leo was still asleep, his chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm that belied the danger coiled in the very room with him. I had to act normal. That was the first rule of survival, the one I'd have to cling to like a lifeline. Any deviation, any hint of suspicion, and Bethany would know I was onto her. I had no idea what she was capable of, but the camera told me it was far more than I could have ever imagined. I went through the morning routine on autopilot, my movements stiff and deliberate. Making breakfast, packing Leo's lunch for kindergarten, a stream of cheerful chatter flowing from my lips that felt like a foreign language. Every word was a performance. Every smile was a lie. I placed Barnaby back in his usual spot on the armchair after Leo left for school, positioning him so the lens had its customary view of the living room. The thought made my skin crawl. I was complicit in my own surveillance. I spent the day oscillating between frantic, silent panic and a cold, methodical need for answers. I started with David's death. I pulled out the preliminary death certificate, the papers from the hospital. Myocardial infarction. The words were so clinical, so final, but they felt wrong. I turned on my computer, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I felt a fresh wave of paranoia. Could she be monitoring my internet activity? I didn't know how sophisticated she was. I used my phone, tethering it to my laptop to use its cellular data, a small, perhaps futile attempt to stay off my home's Wi-Fi network. I started searching. Poisons that mimic heart attacks. The search results were a descent into a world I never knew existed. Aconite, digoxin, potassium chloride. My eyes landed on the last one. Potassium chloride, an electrolyte used in medicine, but lethal in high doses. It worked by stopping the heart. An overdose was difficult to detect in a standard autopsy unless the medical examiner was specifically looking for it. And why would they? David was a healthy man who just suddenly wasn't. The pieces began to click into place with a horrifying certainty. Bethany was a nurse. A pediatric nurse, yes, but she had access. She had knowledge. I remembered her visiting the day before David died. She'd brought over a special herbal tea she'd brewed, claiming it would help with his stress from work. David had been working long hours, trying to close a deal for his architecture firm. He'd been tired. He drank the tea. I had a cup too, but I remembered thinking it tasted bitter and only taking a few sips. David, ever polite, had finished his entire mug. He'd complained of feeling dizzy and nauseous later that evening. We'd chalked it up to exhaustion. He went to bed early. The next morning I found him, lifeless, cold. The memory was a physical agony, a fresh slice into a wound that would never heal. But now it was tainted with a new horror. Had I been sitting right there while my husband was being murdered by his own sister? Had I smiled and thanked her for the poisoned tea? The thought was so monstrous my mind recoiled. I felt a desperate urge to dismiss it, to call it the ramblings of a grief-stricken mind. But the camera in the other room was a silent, damning witness. This wasn't grief, it was reality. I needed more than just a suspicion. I needed proof. I went back to the video files on the camera's memory card. I couldn't watch them all. It would take days, and the thought of reliving the past 2 months under that hidden gaze was unbearable. Instead, I searched for files with larger sizes, files that might contain long conversations. I found one from 3 weeks ago. The timestamp showed it was an afternoon when I'd left Leo with Bethany and her husband Mark. While I went to a grief counseling appointment, I clicked play. The video showed my empty living room for nearly an hour. Then the front door opened. Bethany and Mark walked in, with Leo chattering happily between them. I watched as Bethany settled Leo in front of the TV with a cartoon. Then she and Mark moved into the kitchen, just off camera, but still perfectly audible. Their voices were low, hushed. "Is she getting suspicious at all?" Mark asked. His voice was strained, nervous. He was the weaker of the two. I had always known that. David had always said Mark had no backbone. "Of course not." Bethany's voice was sharp, dismissive. "She's a mess. She can barely figure out how to pay the bills. She's just wandering around this house like a ghost." "I still don't feel right about this, Beth," Mark mumbled. "David was my brother-in-law." "David was a fool who cut you out of the business deal, remember?" she snapped. "He was going to make millions, and what were we going to get? A Christmas card and a pat on the head. He had it coming. Now his money, his life insurance, is going to give us the life we deserve. Life insurance. David had a substantial policy, a policy that listed me as the sole beneficiary, with Leo as the contingent. It was standard, it was meant to protect us, but to them it was a motive. "We just have to be patient," Bethany continued, her voice softening into a conspiratorial purr. "The payout should be processed soon. Once she has the money, we'll move to the next phase. We just need to make sure she doesn't do anything stupid, like give it all to some financial advisor who'll lock it up. This camera is perfect. We know her every move." My blood turned to ice in my veins. The next phase. What did that mean? The implication was chillingly clear. They weren't just after the money, they were after me, and by extension, Leo. Once I had the insurance payout, I would become a liability, a loose end. I slammed the laptop shut, my whole body trembling. This was a plan, a cold, calculated, two-stage plan. First David, then me. They were going to kill me and somehow get custody of Leo, and with him, the inheritance. They were using my grief as a weapon against me, a cloak for their intentions. I looked at the picture of David on my desk, his warm, easy smile, a painful reminder of everything I had lost, and everything I stood to lose. The fear was a living thing inside me, a cold, heavy beast, but beneath the fear, something else was stirring, a flicker of rage, a hot, protective fire. They had taken my husband. They would not take my son. They thought I was a fragile, broken mess. They thought I was a ghost. Fine. It was time to show them just how terrifying a ghost could be. My performance had to be flawless. My grief had to be deeper, my confusion more profound, my helplessness more convincing than ever. They were watching a tragedy. I was going to turn it into a horror story, and they were the monsters. The house felt different now. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner, seemed to hold a new menace. The air itself felt thick with secrets. My home, once a sanctuary, was now a cage, and the zookeeper was watching my every move through the eye of a teddy bear. My new reality was a constant, exhausting performance. When I spoke on the phone, I kept my voice shaky and uncertain. I let the mail pile up on the counter, a visual cue of my overwhelming grief. I accidentally let a pot of water boil over on the stove, sighing with theatrical frustration for the microphone hidden in Barnaby's belly. I was playing the part of a woman on the verge of collapse, a woman who couldn't possibly be a threat. It was a dangerous game. One wrong move, one flicker of suspicion in my eyes during one of Bethany's check-in visits, and it would all be over. Her visits became a form of psychological torture. She would sit at my kitchen table, her face a mask of concern, and ask me how I was managing. "You look so tired, Clara," she'd say, her voice oozing a false sympathy that made my stomach churn. "Are you eating? You're wasting away." I would just nod, offering a weak, watery smile. "It's just hard. Everything feels so hard without David." Inside, I was screaming. I wanted to lunge across the table and claw that smug, deceitful mask from her face. I wanted to show her the video, to hear her lies crumble into dust. But I couldn't, not yet. I had to gather more. I needed something undeniable, something that would put her and Mark away forever. I became a detective in my own life. I started looking for physical clues, anything they might have left behind. I thought back to the tea. The mug David had used. I had washed it, put it away. But what about the tea itself? Bethany had brought it in a small, unlabeled tin. She'd taken it with her when she left. There was nothing there. But the memory sparked another. The day David died, after the paramedics had left, and the house had fallen into a deafening, hollow silence, Bethany had insisted on tidying up. She'd bustled around the bedroom, pulling the sheets off the bed, gathering up the clothes David had worn the night before. At the time, I was in such a state of shock, I barely registered it. I thought it was a kindness, an attempt to spare me the painful task. Now I saw it for what it was, a cleanup. She was removing any potential trace evidence. A bitter, useless anger surged through me. She had thought of everything, but she didn't know about the camera. That was her mistake. Her arrogance would be her undoing. The camera was my only advantage, and I had to use it. I needed to get them to talk again, to say something incriminating while the camera was recording. I had to create a situation that would force their hand, make them reveal more of their plan. The life insurance was the key. According to the recording, that was their entire motivation. I called the insurance company, a genuine call this time, but I made sure to do it in the living room, in full view of Barnaby. I put the call on speakerphone. The agent was kind, patient. He walked me through the final steps. The payout, a substantial 7-figure sum, would be transferred to my account within the next 10 business days. I thanked him, my voice cracking with what he would assume was grief, but what was really a terrifying surge of adrenaline. I knew Bethany would be listening. This was the starting gun. The 10-day countdown had begun. Now I had to give them a reason to panic, to accelerate their next phase. A few days later, I staged another phone call. This time, I pretended to be talking to my oldest friend, Sarah. I sat on the sofa, directly facing the armchair where Barnaby sat, and poured my heart out to a dead line. "I just don't know what to do with it all, Sarah," I said, my voice thick with manufactured tears. "It's so much money. I can't handle it." David always handled the finances. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air for the microphone. My lawyer suggested setting up an irrevocable trust for Leo. He said it would be the safest thing. All the assets, the insurance money, the house, everything would go into the trust. It would be completely protected for Leo's future. I wouldn't even be able to touch the principal. It feels like the right thing to do. The only thing to do. I knew. Those words would be like a lit match to a trail of gasoline. An irrevocable trust. Once that money was in there, it would be untouchable. Legally locked away for my son until he came of age. It would be completely out of their reach. If they were going to make their move, they would have to do it before that trust was established. I gave them a timeline. "I have an appointment with the lawyer to sign the papers next Friday," I said, my voice gaining a hint of resolve. "It feels good to finally have a plan." I ended the call and sat in the silence, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The bait was set, the trap was laid. Now all I could do was wait for the vipers to strike. The waiting was the hardest part. Every ring of the phone, every car that slowed on our street, sent a jolt of fear through me. I barely slept. I ate only when I remembered to. forcing down food that tasted like ash. My only focus was Leo. His innocent laughter was the only thing that kept the darkness at bay. I watched him playing with his toys on the living room floor, Barnaby propped up beside him, and felt a surge of love so fierce it was painful. I was not just fighting for my life, I was fighting for his. The call came 2 days later. It was Bethany. Her voice was sweeter than ever, a thick, cloying syrup. "Clara, honey, I was just thinking about you," she cooed. "You've sounded so stressed lately. Mark and I were wondering, how would you feel if we came over for dinner on Thursday night? I'll cook. You won't have to lift a finger. We just want to spend some time with you and Leo. Make sure you're okay." Thursday, the day before my fictional lawyer's appointment. It was happening. They were making their move. "Oh, Bethany," I said, pitching my voice to sound relieved, grateful. That would be lovely. I'd really like that." "Wonderful," she chirped. "Don't you worry about a thing. We'll bring everything. Consider it a little family time. We'll be there around 7. I hung up the phone, my hand shaking so badly I dropped the receiver into its cradle. Family time. The words were a death sentence. They were coming to my house to kill me. And I had just invited them in. The performance of my life was about to begin, and the final act would take place on Thursday night. I had less than 48 hours to prepare. The 48 hours leading up to Thursday night were the longest of my life. Every tick of the clock was a countdown to a confrontation I wasn't sure I could survive. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. But fear was a luxury I couldn't afford. It had to be secondary to strategy. My first priority was Leo. I couldn't have him in the house when they arrived. The thought of him witnessing anything, of being in the same room as those two monsters, while they enacted their plan, was unthinkable. I called my friend Sarah, for real this time. My voice was steady, practiced from my recent performances. I told her I had a terrible migraine coming on, and that the thought of trying to manage an energetic 5-year-old was overwhelming. "Could you possibly take him for a sleepover?" I asked, hating the lie, but knowing it was necessary. "Just for tonight. I feel awful asking." Sarah, bless her heart, agreed without a moment's hesitation. "Of course, Clara. Don't even think twice. I'll pick him up from school and he can stay the night. You just rest." Relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. Leo would be safe. That was one variable I could control. Now for the others. My second priority was evidence. The camera in Barnaby was my ace in the hole, but I couldn't rely on it alone. What if they found it? What if they were planning to take the bear with them when they left? A twisted memento. I needed a backup. I went to an electronics store in the next town, a place where no one would recognize me. I paid in cash for the smallest, most discreet audio recorder I could find. It was designed to look like a USB flash drive. Perfect. Back at home, I planned my stage. The living room was where Barnaby was, so the main event had to happen there. I needed a place to hide the new recorder, somewhere close to where we would be sitting, somewhere they would never think to look. My eyes landed on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. It was cluttered with family photos, including a large, ornate silver frame holding my favorite picture of David and me. I took the frame down. The back was covered in black velvet, held in place by small metal tabs. I carefully pried them open and slipped the tiny recorder inside, nestled between the photo and the backing. I positioned it near a small opening where one of the tabs was, hoping it would be enough to capture clear audio. I put the frame back on the mantel, adjusting it so it looked completely undisturbed. They would be sitting on the sofa directly across from the fireplace. It was perfect. They would be confessing their crimes to the smiling face of the man they had murdered. The irony was so bitter, it almost made me gag. My third priority was my own safety. I knew they intended to poison me. Bethany's comment about bringing everything, her previous use of the special tea, it was her method. It was quiet, clean, and easily mistaken for natural causes. I couldn't simply refuse to eat or drink whatever she brought. That would raise immediate suspicion. I had to find a way to avoid ingesting the poison without them realizing it. I spent hours pacing my kitchen, my mind racing through scenarios. I could pretend to spill my drink. I could claim a sudden stomach bug and refuse food. But those options were clumsy, too likely to make them nervous. Then I remembered something from a first aid course I'd taken years ago. Activated charcoal. It was used in emergency rooms to treat certain types of poisoning, working by binding to the toxins in the stomach and preventing them from being absorbed into the bloodstream. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it was a massive risk, but it was better than nothing. It was a sliver of a chance. I drove to a 24-hour pharmacy and bought a bottle of activated charcoal capsules. I would take a dose an hour before they arrived. It might not save me completely, but it could buy me time. Time to get them to talk. Time for my plan to work. Finally, I had to alert the authorities. But I couldn't just call 911 and tell them my sister-in-law was coming over to kill me. They would think I was insane. I needed to present them with a credible threat, something they couldn't ignore. I decided to make an anonymous tip. I used a payphone, a relic I had to drive 20 minutes to find, and disguised my voice, making it sound deeper, more frantic. I told the dispatcher that I had overheard a man named Mark talking at a bar about how his wife, a nurse named Bethany, was going to take care of her sister-in-law for good on Thursday night to get her hands on some insurance money. I gave them my address. I said they were planning to make it look like an accident. You need to get someone over there around 8 o'clock, I urged, my voice raspy. They're crazy, they'll kill her. I hung up before they could ask any questions. I had no idea if they would take it seriously. An anonymous tip was flimsy, but it was a seed of doubt planted in the right place. Maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to make them send a patrol car to check on a disturbance, giving me a potential lifeline. Thursday arrived, a gray, overcast day that matched my mood. I dropped Leo off at school, hugging him so tightly he squirmed. I love you more than all the stars, my sweet boy, I whispered into his hair, my voice thick. I love you more than chocolate cake, he giggled, oblivious. As I watched him run into the schoolyard, I felt a resolve harden within me. This was for him. Everything was for him. I spent the day preparing. I cleaned the house, not because I cared about dust, but because I needed the repetitive, mindless motion to keep the panic at bay. At 5 o'clock, I took the charcoal capsules, their black dust coating my tongue with a gritty film. At 6, I turned on the audio recorder in the picture frame. At 6:30, I positioned Barnaby in his armchair, his blank eyes aimed at the sofa. The stage was set. The actors were in place. All that was left was for the villains to make their entrance. At exactly 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. My heart leapt into my throat. I took a deep, shuddering breath, smoothed down my sweater, and pasted a fragile smile on my face. I walked to the door and opened it. There they were. Bethany was beaming, holding a casserole dish and a bottle of wine. Mark hovered behind her, his eyes shifty, unable to meet mine. "Clara," Bethany exclaimed, her voice a symphony of false cheer. "We're so glad we came. You look like you could use some company." She pushed past me into the house, her perfume filling the air with a cloying, artificial sweetness. The final act had begun. The smell of Bethany's cheap perfume was suffocating. It clung to the air in my hallway, a synthetic floral scent trying to mask the rot underneath. She swept into my kitchen as if she owned the place, placing the casserole on the counter with a proprietary air. "Beef stroganoff," she announced. "Your favorite." It wasn't my favorite, it was David's. The choice was a deliberate, cruel twist of the knife. Mark shuffled in behind her, carrying a canvas bag that held the bottle of wine. He still wouldn't look at me, his gaze fixed on a spot on the floor just past my left shoulder. He looked pale and sweaty, a man being dragged along by a will stronger than his own. "Mark, say hello to Clara," Bethany chided, her tone light but with an edge of steel. "Don't be rude." He mumbled a greeting, his eyes darting around the room, anywhere but at my face. He looked like a cornered animal. Bethany, on the other hand, was the picture of calm confidence. She was the predator, utterly at ease in her hunting ground. She retrieved 2 wine glasses from my cabinet, with a familiar ease that made my skin crawl. "Let's have a glass of wine while the stroganoff heats up," she said, her smile unwavering. "A little something to help you relax." She held up the bottle. It was a deep red, the label unfamiliar. I watched her hands as she expertly worked the corkscrew. Her fingers were long and slender, the hands of a nurse, hands trained to heal. But they were also the hands that had measured out a lethal dose for her own brother. She poured 2 generous glasses, her movements fluid and precise. She placed one on the counter in front of me and kept the other for herself. Or so it seemed. I watched, my senses on high alert for the moment of truth. It came when she turned her back to me, pretending to adjust the temperature on the oven. I saw her hand dip into the pocket of her cardigan. In a swift, almost imperceptible movement, she tipped a small vial of clear liquid into the glass she had designated for me. There was no sound, no splash. If I hadn't been watching for it, I would have missed it entirely. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The activated charcoal in my stomach felt like a pathetic, flimsy shield against the poison now swirling in that glass. She turned back to me, her smile brighter than ever, and picked up the glasses. She handed the tainted one to me. "To family," she said, raising her glass, "and to new beginnings." My hand was trembling as I took the glass from her. The wine was a dark, blood red. I looked into her eyes over the rim of my glass, searching for any flicker of doubt, of humanity. There was nothing, only a cold, triumphant gleam. "To family," I echoed, my voice a dry whisper. I had to create a distraction. I couldn't drink it, but I couldn't refuse it. I brought the glass toward my lips, my mind racing. My eyes darted around, the room looking for an out, an opportunity. My gaze landed on the canvas bag Mark had brought, which he had set down on the floor by the kitchen island. A corner of a book was peeking out. On a desperate whim, I took a step back, pretending to stumble. "Oh, clumsy me," I gasped, lurching sideways. The wine glass tipped, and the dark red liquid splashed across the tiled floor, a miniature crime scene at my feet. Bethany's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A flash of pure fury crossed her face, before being instantly replaced by her mask of concern. "Oh, Clara, are you all right? Don't worry about the mess." "I'm so sorry," I said, pressing a hand to my forehead. I felt a little dizzy for a second. It was the perfect excuse, playing right into the role of the frail, unsteady widow she believed me to be. "You poor thing," she cooed, her composure restored. "You really haven't been taking care of yourself. Sit down, sit down. I'll pour you another glass." She steered me toward the living room sofa, her touch feeling like a brand on my arm. Mark was already there, perched nervously on the edge of the armchair, Barnaby's armchair. He had pushed the bear aside to make room for himself. My blood ran cold. The camera. Its view was now partially blocked by Mark's back. I had to get him to move. I sat on the sofa, directly across from the mantelpiece, where my second recorder was silently listening. Bethany went back to the kitchen. I could hear the clink of the bottle against a fresh glass. "Mark," I said, my voice soft, "could you do me a favor? I feel a bit of a chill. Would you mind lighting the fire?" It was a mild evening, not cold at all, but it was a plausible request. The fireplace was gas-powered, operated by a key on the hearth. To light it, he would have to move. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of guilt and fear. Sure, Clara," he stammered, grateful for a task, any task, that would allow him to look away from me. He practically leaped off the armchair, kneeling down on the hearth and fumbling with the key. Barnaby, now unobscured, stared blankly at the scene. The camera's view was clear again. Bethany returned with a fresh glass of wine and a plate of appetizers. She set them down on the coffee table in front of me. "Here you go, honey," she said. "Now be careful with this one." The threat was veiled, but it hung in the air between us. The fire flickered to life, casting dancing shadows across the room and illuminating the photograph of David on the mantel. His smiling face seemed to watch over us. I didn't touch the wine. Instead, I leaned forward, my hands clasped together, and decided it was time to change the direction of the conversation. It was time to pull at the threads. "You know," I began, my voice quiet but clear, "I was thinking about David today, about the business. He was so excited about that new project." I looked at Mark, who was now hovering awkwardly by the fireplace. He was, "Sorry you weren't a part of it, Mark. He told me he felt bad about it." Mark flinched as if I had struck him. He shot a panicked look at Bethany. "That's not true," Bethany said, her voice sharp. "David was arrogant. He thought he could do it all himself. He never gave Mark the credit he deserved." "Is that what you think?" I asked, keeping my gaze steady on her. "Or is that what you told Mark to make him feel better?" The air in the room grew thick, charged with unspoken words. The easy facade of a friendly family dinner was cracking, revealing the ugly truth beneath. I wasn't playing the victim anymore. I was an interrogator, and the questioning had just begun. Bethany's placid expression tightened, the muscles around her jaw bunching almost imperceptibly. The mask was beginning to slip. "I don't know what you're talking about, Clara," she said, her voice losing its syrupy sweetness and taking on a brittle edge. "Grief is clearly making you confused." "Am I confused?" I pressed on, my own voice gaining a strength I didn't know I possessed. The charcoal in my stomach was a small, secret piece of armor. I don't think so. I think I'm starting to see things more clearly than ever before. I've been thinking a lot about the day David died, about the tea you brought over. I saw Mark's face pale. He took a half step back, as if trying to distance himself from the conversation, from the room, from his own complicity. Bethany, however, held her ground. She even managed a small dismissive laugh, though it sounded more like breaking glass. My herbal tea? Clara, you're becoming hysterical. It was chamomile. Was it? I asked, letting the question hang in the air. I let my eyes drift from her face to the wineglass on the table, the untouched poison. You know, it's funny. David felt so sick after he drank it, dizzy, nauseous, almost like his body was trying to fight something off. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the tense silence. Bethany's eyes narrowed. The pretense was over. We both knew it. She had underestimated me, and in her arrogance, she had walked straight into my trap. "You should drink your wine, Clara," she said, her voice low and menacing. It was no longer a suggestion, it was an order. "It will help you calm your nerves." "I don't think I need to be calm, Bethany," I replied, my gaze unwavering. "I think I need to be angry. Shouldn't I be angry? My husband is dead, my son is without a father, and his aunt and uncle are sitting in my living room, trying to convince me it was all just a tragic accident." "It was a tragic accident," Mark blurted out, his voice cracking. He sounded like a child trying to convince himself a monster wasn't real. His heart just gave out. "Did it, Mark?" I turned my full attention to him, seeing the weak link, the crack in their united front. Or did Bethany help it along? With her special knowledge, her access to things from the hospital, things that stop a heart and leave no trace? Mark started to tremble, his eyes darting between me and his wife. He was unraveling. Bethany shot him a look of pure venom, a silent command to shut his mouth, but it was too late, and I had planted the seed of discord. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if I were sharing a secret with him. "She's been lying to you, Mark. She told you David cut you out, that he looked down on you. But that wasn't true. He loved you. He was worried about you, about how much she controlled you. He told me he was going to offer you a partnership after this project closed. He was going to surprise you." It was a lie, a complete fabrication. David had been frustrated with Mark's lack of ambition, but he had never planned a partnership. But Mark didn't know that, and in his guilt-ridden, terrified state, he was desperate to believe in a different version of reality. "That's not true," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. He was looking at Bethany now, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Tell her it's not true, Beth." Bethany's composure finally snapped. She stood up, her movements sharp and aggressive. "She's playing games, Mark. She's lost her mind. Can't you see that? She's making things up to hurt us, to drive us apart." "Am I?" I stood up too, so we were facing each other. "Then why is there an appointment in my calendar for tomorrow morning to sign papers for an irrevocable trust for Leo? A trust that would make David's insurance money completely inaccessible to you. You didn't know that, did you, Mark? She probably told you that once I was gone, you'd be Leo's guardians, that you'd have control of everything. But you wouldn't have gotten a dime. The trust would have seen to that. She wasn't just planning to get rid of me. She was planning to get rid of you, too, once you were no longer useful." The color drained from Mark's face. He looked at Bethany, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he seemed to see the predator behind the mask of his wife. He saw that he wasn't her partner. He was just another tool to be used and discarded. "Is that true, Beth?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Is that what you were going to do?" Bethany ignored him. Her eyes were locked on me, blazing with a murderous hatred. The game was up, and she knew it. The time for subtlety and poison was over. "You clever little bitch," she hissed, her voice a low snarl. "You think you've figured it all out, don't you?" "I have," I said, my heart pounding. This was the most dangerous moment, the moment a cornered animal attacks. "I know you murdered my husband, and I know you came here tonight to murder me." "Yes," she said, a chilling, triumphant smile spreading across her face. "I did. He was a weak, sentimental fool, and you're no better. He deserved to die. He was holding us back." Mark let out a strangled sob. "Bethany, no." "Shut up, Mark," she screamed, whirling on him. "You were always a coward, too weak to take what you deserve. I had to do it. I did it for us." She turned back to me, her eyes wild. "And now I'm going to finish it." She lunged for me. All my planning, all my strategy had come down to this: raw, physical violence. She was faster than I expected, her fingers clawing for my throat. I stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp as I fell onto the sofa. She was on top of me in an instant, her weight pinning me down. Her hands were strong, the nails digging into my skin. I struggled against her, my arms flailing, but she was fueled by a desperate feral rage. I could feel the air being squeezed from my lungs. Black spots danced in my vision. I was losing. After everything, I was going to die here, on my own sofa, murdered by my husband's sister. Through the roaring in my ears, I heard a sound. A loud, splintering crack. The front door. It burst open, slamming against the wall. "Police! Don't move!" The voice was a thunderclap, shattering the violent silence. Bethany froze, her head snapping up toward the sound. In that split second of hesitation, I gathered all the strength I had left. I bucked my hips, throwing her off balance, and shoved her with all my might. She tumbled off the sofa, landing hard on the floor. I scrambled away, gasping for air, my throat raw and burning. 2 uniformed officers were in the room, their guns drawn and pointed at Bethany. Behind them stood a man in a detective's coat, my anonymous tip. They had come. They had actually come. Bethany stared at them, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. The huntress had become the prey. It was over. The aftermath was a blur of flashing blue and red lights, crackling radios, and the calm, authoritative voices of people who were now in control. I was wrapped in a coarse wool blanket, a paramedic checking my pulse. While I gave a preliminary statement to the detective, a man with tired eyes named Miller, I watched as they led Bethany away in handcuffs. She didn't struggle. All the fight had gone out of her. Her face was a blank mask of shock, her eyes empty. It was as if the evil inside her had retreated, leaving behind a hollow shell. She didn't even look at me as they guided her into the back of a police car. Mark was a different story. He had collapsed into a weeping heap on the floor, sobbing hysterically as another officer read him his rights. He was a broken man, a pathetic accomplice, swept up in a current far too strong for him. I felt a fleeting, surprising pang of pity for him, quickly extinguished by the memory of David's cold body and the poisoned wine on my coffee table. Detective Miller was patient, his questions gentle but precise. I told him everything. I started with the camera in the teddy bear, the cold, hard lump that had unraveled my entire world. I took him to my office and showed him the video files. I told him about the audio recorder hidden in the picture frame on the mantelpiece. A forensics team was already carefully bagging it as evidence. "You recorded their conversation tonight?" Miller asked, a flicker of professional appreciation in his tired eyes. "Yes," I said, my voice hoarse. She confessed to everything." "You were very brave," he said. "It wasn't a compliment, it was a simple statement of fact. And very smart. You played a very dangerous game, Mrs. Evans." "I had to," I whispered, clutching the blanket tighter around me. "It was for my son." The name hung in the air, a stark reminder of what was at stake. Leo. He was safe at Sarah's house, sleeping soundly, completely unaware that his world had been saved from a precipice he never even knew he was on. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, witness statements, and the grim task of identifying David's body for a second time as part of the new homicide investigation. The initial autopsy had missed the signs, but the new, more thorough examination, guided by Bethany's confession, found exactly what they were looking for: elevated levels of potassium in his system, consistent with a fatal injection. The story became a local media sensation. "The Black Widow nurse," one headline screamed. "Family betrayal ends in murder plot." The details were sensational, a true crime drama played out in our quiet suburban neighborhood. I became a reluctant local celebrity, the grieving widow who had uncovered a monstrous plot. Reporters camped out on my lawn. I ignored them, keeping the blinds drawn, turning my home back into a sanctuary, but this time a sanctuary from the outside world, not a prison of surveillance. Sarah was my rock through it all. She screened my calls, did my grocery shopping, and fiercely protected me and Leo from the prying eyes of the world. She never once said, "I told you so," about Bethany, whom she had never trusted. She just held my hand, made me tea, and let me cry when the weight of it all became too much. The trial was swift. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The video from Barnaby's camera, the crystal clear audio of Bethany's confession from the picture frame, and Mark's full tearful confession in exchange for a lesser sentence. It was an open and shut case. Bethany's defense tried to argue that she was mentally unstable, a victim of a controlling personality disorder. But the prosecution painted a clear picture of a cold, calculating sociopath motivated by greed and resentment. Her own words, captured by my hidden recorder, were her undoing. "He deserved to die," her voice echoed through the silent courtroom, chilling everyone who heard it. I was there for the verdict. I needed to see it through to the end. When the foreman read the word "guilty" on the charge of first-degree murder for David's death, and "guilty" again for the attempted murder of me, I felt not a surge of triumph, but a profound, hollow emptiness. Justice had been served, but it wouldn't bring David back. It wouldn't erase the scars. Bethany was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mark received a lesser sentence, 15 years for conspiracy to commit murder. I saw him look at me once during the sentencing, his eyes filled with a pathetic, pleading shame. I looked away. He had made his choice. After the trial, the silence descended again, but this time it was a peaceful silence, not a menacing one. The reporters eventually left. The world moved on to the next sensational story, and I was left to pick up the pieces of my life, a life that had been shattered and painstakingly reassembled. The first thing I did was sell the house. There were too many ghosts there, too many memories tainted by the horror of what had happened. I couldn't look at the living room sofa without feeling the phantom weight of Bethany on top of me, her hands at my throat. I couldn't walk through the kitchen without seeing the ghost of a wine glass full of poison. Leo and I moved to a small cottage by the coast, an hour's drive away, a place with no connection to our old life, a place where the air smelled of salt and new beginnings. We painted the walls bright, cheerful colors and planted a garden in the backyard. We were starting over. One day, a few months after we moved, a box arrived. It was from the police department, a box of personal effects that had been held as evidence. Inside, nestled amongst old case files, was Barnaby. I lifted him out of the box. His fur was a little matted, his stitched smile still unnervingly cheerful. The police had removed the camera, leaving a small, neat incision in his side. He was just a teddy bear again. I took him out to the backyard where Leo was playing. "Look who's back," I said softly. Leo's eyes lit up. "Barnaby," he shouted, running to me and hugging the bear tightly. He didn't know the bear's secret. He didn't know the role this stuffed animal had played in saving our lives. To him, Barnaby was just a friend, a keeper of childhood secrets, a silent, fluffy guardian. And I decided to keep it that way. Some truths are too heavy for a child to bear. He would know one day when he was older, but for now I would let him have his innocence. I watched him run off across the grass, Barnaby tucked under his arm, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. I had faced the monster hiding in my family, and I had won. I had protected my son. I had honored my husband's memory by exposing his killer. The world was not the safe, predictable place I had once believed it to be. Evil could wear a familiar face, a loving smile, but so could courage. Sometimes it looks like a grieving widow who refuses to break. Sometimes it's a mother's love, fierce and unyielding. And sometimes it's hidden in the most unexpected of places, waiting for its moment, even inside the stitched-up heart of a teddy bear. The transition to our new life by the sea was not seamless. It was a conscious daily effort. Healing, I learned, is not a destination you arrive at, but a path you choose to walk every single morning. For weeks, I would wake up with my heart pounding, the residual adrenaline of a nightmare I couldn't quite remember, and I would have to lie still and listen to the sound of the waves outside my window to remind myself where I was. I was safe. Leo was safe. The monsters were locked away. Some nights, I would tiptoe into Leo's room and just watch him sleep, his small face so peaceful in the moonlight. He'd have Barnaby clutched in his arms, the bear's button eyes glinting in the dark. The sight no longer filled me with dread. Instead, I felt a strange sense of gratitude. That bear, that Trojan horse of betrayal, had also been my salvation. It was a paradox I was still learning to live with. I sought out a therapist, a kind woman with a calm voice, who helped me unpack the layers of trauma. We talked about the violation, the deep cellular shock of discovering that the people you trusted, the people who were supposed to be your family, were predators in disguise. She helped me understand that the hypervigilance I felt, The way I would scan every new face for hidden motives was a normal response to an abnormal situation. It was a scar, she said, and like any scar, it would fade over time, but would always be a part of me, a reminder of the wound it had healed over. I had to learn to trust again, starting with myself. I had to trust the instincts that had told me something was wrong. I had to trust the strength that had allowed me to fight back. In my old life, I had always deferred to David in major decisions. He was the confident one, the architect of our lives. I was the quiet partner, the nurturer. But his death and the events that followed had forced me to become my own architect. I was building a new life for myself and my son, brick by painful brick. One of the hardest parts was navigating the complex web of family and friends who had been caught in the crossfire. David's parents were utterly destroyed by the revelation. Their daughter had murdered their son. It was a truth so monstrous, so unnatural, that it shattered their world. They clung to me and Leo, their only remaining connection to their lost son. Our shared grief was a fragile bridge between us, and we crossed it carefully, speaking of David often, keeping his memory alive not as a victim, but as the loving husband, son, and father he had been. My own parents were a different story. They were horrified, of course, but their horror was mixed with a kind of bewildered pity for me, as if I were a delicate vase that had been irreparably cracked. They tiptoed around me, afraid to say the wrong thing, which was, in its own way, just as isolating. It was Sarah who remained my anchor. She treated me not as a victim or a hero, but as Clara. She would show up with wine and bad movies and sit with me in comfortable silence when I didn't want to talk. She was the one who encouraged me to find a new hobby, something just for myself. I started taking pottery classes at a small local studio. The feeling of the clay spinning beneath my hands was grounding. It was messy and unpredictable, but with patience and focus, I could shape it into something solid, something beautiful. I was taking the chaos of my life and creating order. I was healing. As Leo grew older, the idyllic bubble of our seaside cottage couldn't protect him from the world forever. The internet is a vast and unforgiving archive. I knew that one day he would type his father's name or his own into a search bar, and the whole ugly story would come spilling out. I decided I had to be the one to tell him, to frame the narrative with love and truth, not sensational headlines. I chose his 10th birthday. He was old enough to understand complex ideas, but still young enough to see the world through a lens of innate goodness. We sat on the beach, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. I told him the story, simplifying the darkest parts, but not shying away from the essential truth. I told him that his father had been a wonderful man who was loved very much, and I told him that sometimes people get sick in their hearts, that a darkness can grow inside them that makes them do terrible, selfish things. I explained that his Aunt Bethany and Uncle Mark had been very sick in that way, and that they had hurt his father and had wanted to hurt us. I told him that the police had made sure they couldn't hurt anyone ever again. He listened quietly, his expression serious, his eyes fixed on the horizon. When I was finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he asked the one question I had been dreading. Why? It was the question I had asked myself 1,000 times. Why the greed? Why the hatred? Why the utter lack of humanity? I don't know, sweetheart, I answered honestly. Sometimes there are no good reasons for the bad things people do. All we can do is choose not to let their darkness put out our light. He seemed to accept that. He leaned his head against my shoulder, and we watched the last sliver of sun disappear below the waves. In that moment, I knew we would be okay. We had faced the darkness and walked out into the light, blinking and scarred, but whole. Life is different now. The sharp edges of the trauma have softened. The fear is no longer a constant companion, but a distant echo, a reminder to be vigilant, but not to live in fear. I am no longer just a widow, a victim, or a survivor. I am a potter, a gardener, a friend. I am a mother, watching her son grow into a kind and compassionate young man who, despite everything, still believes in the good in people. Occasionally, I think of Bethany in her prison cell. I don't feel hatred for her anymore. I feel a profound and desolate pity. She had a family, a career, a life, and she traded it all for a pile of money she never got, fueled by a bitterness that consumed her from the inside out. She is a ghost in her own life, haunting the empty corridors of her own bad choices. I chose a different path. I chose to live. I chose to love. I chose to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. My life is not the one I planned, but it is a good life. It is a peaceful life. It is a life lived in the light. And every night when I tuck my son into bed and see a worn, golden teddy bear still sitting on his pillow, I am reminded that even in the darkest of places, you can find the strength to fight, to survive, and to begin again.